So I'm in my garage today cutting up a deer. I've been thinking about doing a how-to video, but the fact is there's a ton of how-to cut up a deer videos on YouTube, and I think a lot of people do a better job than I could do because of the fact that this isn't my deer. They always come to me different. You know, people have split it differently, people have shot it differently. Like for instance, this one obviously has one leg removed already, and I've taken off the flank and the rib section, but the leg that's over here had been shot through, and that stuff just happens. You know, you never know where it's been shot, in the rib cage or the leg, the head, or whatever. So pretty much every time I cut game for somebody, it's a different process. I don't think I've ever cut two game animals the same way. And once you know the basic principle, you just do what you have to do and get it done. So that part's simple. There's a ton of videos out there that show it, and I think anybody with a knife can get a deer processed at home and put in the freezer. So that part's pretty basic. What I wanted to show today, since I'm cutting this one for a friend, is that I have free reign on this one. I can do whatever I want, really. I know the basic premise of how they want their roast and steaks cut and that kind of thing, but I have some options for other things. So that's what I want to show you today, is just a couple of, I would say, variety cuts that are not commonly done. Most hunters just bone everything out and cut it into as big a chunks as they can, or as many steaks as they can, and grind the rest and call it good. But I think more can be done with that, and maybe it's not really necessary, but it's fun, at least for me. The first thing I'm going to show you is, if you're a hunter, you'll probably recognize the basic structure of what we have here. The leg here comes down into the flank. I already cut into this before I decided that maybe I'd try to make a video out of this because some of you might enjoy it. But sorry about that. Anyways, the flank has come off of here, and that's a boneless piece. And that's all just something that you sort out for trim, for ground or jerky or whatever. And that was one of my first cuts. You know, you take that off, and then you hit the rib section. You come out off the rib section over here along one of the rib bones, and then you get a nice piece that you can sort out later on, and that gives you easy access to your tenderloins, which of course are going to run in here. So the tenderloins are gone on this one, and the variety cut, or the unusual cut that I want to show you this time, is making a rack of venison. It's not a necessary thing. You could easily just trim your loins or your back straps, whatever you want to call it, straight out and make it into steaks and call it good. But a rack of venison is an old school cut that makes for a really nice meal. Like say you want to save it for a Christmas dinner. It's not something that's going to sit in your freezer until next summer because it is a bone-in cut, and it may get bone sour or whatever. So you're good for 2 or 3 months. But it's a nice thing for a special occasion, and I'll show you how I did that. But the first thing was to come down to the rib section, and then you want to count down 7 ribs. So go 7 ribs, make a mark onto, or cut through actually, the ribs, and then I'll show you what I did from there. Let's move over to the table. Okay, so here's the rib section, and as I mentioned before, I moved through this quite a bit before I decided I was going to make a video about this, so I apologize for that again, but you'll get the basic idea. What I did was I counted down 7 ribs from the flank section, and then you score with your knife through the meat, and once that's done, you can mark how long you want your finger bones to be on your rack of venison. So while the weight's still on the top, which will be your shoulder blade and all that kind of thing, while that weight's still on there, I recommend that you cut through your finger bones then, because it holds everything steadier and it all just kind of falls out of the way. And then you can saw through the vertebrae there and knock off the front shoulders and the extra rib section, which will be basically brisket section, and that'll all come away in one nice piece that you can deal with easily afterwards. So that leaves you with a 7-bone double rib section, which they actually call a saddle. This will be your saddle. So another thing you could do with this is you could make it into individual chops, which would be double rib chops. And that's a really fantastic cut as well. You do that by just cutting between each rib, and then saw through the bone in the middle, and you'd have a nice double loin chop, and you French the bone up here, which means just cut away above the rib section right up to the end here. So that's an option too, for a little bit of a fancier cut. So the next thing that I had to do was break out my saw, and of course I have a substantial saw. This is I believe a 21-inch bone saw. You don't need anything that big, but any saw that's capable of cutting through bone will do. And you saw along just off of the vertebrae, just at the top of the ribs, and that's called the chine section. So you just cut through that section, but not into the meat. You have to be careful not to cut into the meat. It's a little bit of a tricky process, but it only takes a matter of maybe 45 seconds to get through that. It's very quick. It's not as hard as you'd think it might be. And once that's done, you just take your boning knife and you carefully cut along and then down the finger bones here, the feather bones I mean, and that releases what's going to become your rack. So here you have a nice section with the rib and then what's going to be your Frenched finger bones. And the same thing on the other side, and that's a pretty easy process. Again, this is a fancy thing. It's not something that you would necessarily want to do on every deer that you get, because it's just extra effort. But if you want something for a special occasion, maybe get a little bit more yield out of your deer, then so be it. Now the next thing I have to do is remove this membrane. There's a membrane along the rib section here, and that makes for a not so pleasant rack eating experience. So you want to get rid of that. And at work I would use a meat cutting hook, a butcher's hook, but at home I don't have one of those here in the garage, so I'm just using a regular flat screwdriver, and you just release it at one end or the other, and you can see this membrane coming up. Crank that off of there. Sometimes it takes a few tries to get it cleanly out of there, but you want it gone. So go ahead and do that to both your racks, and I'm going to show you the next step in a minute here. Alright, so now that the rack is peeled, the next step is to decide where you want to French it to. And you have a choice here. You can go right down to the loin, but you have to leave a little bit of meat to keep your bones attached here, or you can go up a little bit higher and keep some of this fatty bit in here. So once you decide that, you just score a line across evenly, and then from there you run your knife along the ribs and you remove that fat and meat that's sitting on top of the ribs. There you go. It's easy enough. Now you have a couple layers up here, and again you have a choice. You can either just trim the fat down, which would look like this, and still leave perhaps a fat cover on this thing if you like the taste of deer fat, or you can take that right off, and there may even be a couple layers of meat in there that you can get through and take that right off. So once you get that figured out to where you want it to be, then you go ahead and French the bones. And that's a simple process. Just go along the bone right down to the line that you scored and remove the excess meat, which is of course very suitable for grinding or making sausage. So you keep that up, and when you're finished, it's going to look like this one, which is the other side of that loin rib section. That's a nice looking rack. So yeah, that'll make for a beautiful dinner. And if you wanted to, if you had 2 racks and you had to feed a bunch of people, you could always do that to it and then tie the 2 together and make what's called a crown roast. So there's a variety cut for you, and I'm going to finish the other one up, and then I'll show you maybe 1 or 2 more before I finish this deer up. Alright, so here's the next little thing we're going to look at. Now this is a loin. Some of you guys would call it the back strap. I call it the loin. This would have been what was attached to a rib section, and this went up to the pelvis bone, the hip area. So it's a little short because of the fact that I made racks out of this deer. So we get this nice short little piece of loin. In the grocery store they probably call that a strip loin, depending on where you're at. The fact is, this deer only weighed 100 pounds, dressed out. So it's not going to make for a very, very big steak. There's things you can do with that. You could cut almost all the way through and then make a full cut through, fold it over, and call it a medallion. I don't personally like doing that. You can do that, and you can tie it together to hold it together, or you can just leave it as a butterflied steak. Personally, I prefer to do it this way. Take this little piece here, this is the sirloin end, and this is down into your actual strip loin part, and just cut it like that. Trim the fat however you want, and call it good. See, now what you've got here is basically two steaks that will grill or bake or broil, whatever you want to do, evenly without drying out. And then when you slice this thing to serve, you just slice it across the grain, down, just like that, and you'll have beautiful, cooked to whatever temperature you want pieces that won't dry out. So rather than making tiny little steaks out of a deer that's, say, 100 pounds or less, I would recommend doing that. Once you get above 100 pounds, up to like 200 pounds or whatever, you're starting to get into the sizes that's going to make for a reasonable steak. So that's just kind of an old school option for you to consider when you're cutting out your deer based on size. Alright, on to the next little trick. So here's the next piece we're going to look at. This is the front leg of this little deer. And what I want to do, I've actually showed this before, is I want to make use of this piece right here, which would be called the shank. And that often gets trimmed out and goes to waste, the bones tossed. And I've mentioned this before, but I think that this could be put to a lot better use because of the quality of the meat in it. A lot of people look at the meat in this part of the leg and they see what looks like sinew and gristle, but it's really not. It's actually just connective tissues and things like that that make for the most amazing, flavorful soup or stew material, whatever. It's rich and it's delicious, so I really highly recommend that you make use of it. Now, one easy way to get into the shank, maybe not easy, but a little bit easier than just trying to guess over here, is to come in from the front through the natural bend and then sort of follow it into the joint. Yeah, it fools me every time, especially on these small deer. Then once you get into the joint, there it is, a little far down. Once you get into the joint, you're just going to give it a good old-fashioned crunch. That'll break it open. So once you're through there, boom, you've got a deer shank ready to go. Now, just as it is, you're not going to get all that flavor out of this deer shank. So what you want to do is knife cut through the meat about halfway down, all the way around, and then use your saw and get through the rest of this. Sorry, this is probably going to shake the camera, so hang on for a sec. Alright. You can see that didn't take a lot of effort. But now what we've got there is this wonderful meat with its rich flavor, and then this tiny little bit of marrow in the center of these deer bones. So that's perfect for stewing, slow cooking, whatever you want. When you cook this meat, it'll actually shrink down on the bones, so it presents very nice on a plate, and it makes for a wonderful dish. You could even make osso buco just like you would with a veal shank or a lamb shank. So that's something that I highly recommend you take advantage of if you get a nice deer. And since we're at this point, I actually want to talk about one more thing too, and that's aging your deer. A lot of people will hang their deer for up to 2 weeks, and they say that it helps get rid of the game flavor. What I'm finding as I continue cutting deer, which I do a lot of, is that 5 to 7 days is ideal, especially for a deer. This one's been aged 5 days, and if you look at the outside of it, it's not so hard and dry that I need to remove that for cooking purposes. If you age longer than that, you tend to have to take more off the outside, and any piece that's been covered up and hasn't gotten good circulation is garbage. So the longer you age a deer, the more you're going to throw away. This is not just my personal opinion, this is speaking from experience. I'm finding that 4 to 6 days is the maximum that I would age any deer that is for my own personal consumption, just because of the fact that you're going to get waste, and what happens is the flavor of some pieces that are smaller and starting to decompose actually gets into the meat, and it gets quite nasty. So that is how I feel on the subject, and you can take it or leave it, but just thought I'd throw that in there while we were here. So here we're looking at what would probably be the most simple cut of this whole thing. This is actually a major time-saving cut too, because most people don't know the anatomy of this piece well enough to take the bones out and make effective use of the meat. This is the neck, and all I've done is saw through the top and saw through the bottom. This can be done without using a saw, but a saw makes it quicker and easier without having to have the intimate knowledge of exactly where the skull is and the atlas bone and all that kind of stuff, and knowing how to get between the vertebrae. So a saw just takes a couple of quick strokes and you're through at the top and you're through at the bottom. And what this is a slow cooking piece, a very slow cooking piece. I would say that I would rate this about as highly as I would a lamb shoulder, to be honest with you, believe it or not. If you slow cook this thing properly, it is a delicious piece of meat, and you'll get way more out of it once it's cooked than you will trying to pick the meat out of it while it's raw. So it's not one that you could keep in your freezer for a long time. I know a lot of people don't like to store game bone in because they're afraid of bone sour. But if you're going to have it for a couple months, maybe 3 months or something like that, it's going to be just fine, as long as the bullet shot that killed this animal wasn't close to this cut. So that is one that I highly recommend for maximum yield of your game animal, is just save the neck whole as is, slow cook it. I actually like to marinate this kind of thing in coarse pepper, coarse salt, lemon juice, and then whatever your favorite herb might be. Basil, tarragon is really nice, garlic, whatever suits your fancy. That's it. That's a simple cut, simple as can be. Whole neck for slow cooking. So one last thing I'm going to show you here today is a quick game tying knot. We're into more regular cuts now. This happens to be a sirloin tip out of that deer, and you don't need to tie roast. You can just leave it whole as is, but for presentation's sake it is nice. And if you start getting into cuts like say this, where you had to take out the shoulder blade, and that kind of thing, then yeah, you're going to want to tie the muscles back together so that it cooks uniformly and it looks nice on the plate. But yeah, so here's what I do. This is kind of a slower knot than, say, an industrial knot would be, but it gets the job done nicely, and actually this is a fairly versatile knot for other things too. So I start off with my string coming from under the table here, and I grab the tag end with my right hand, and you run it under your piece of meat. There you go, it's gone under. Then you bring it back over the top of the piece of meat so that the two pieces can lay out side by side over 2 fingers. See that? Then you go around your 2 fingers with the tag end, and then you go through the loop that you created twice. So now you hang on to your tag end, drop it with your 2 fingers, and you can just pull it tight with the end that's coming from the ball of twine there. Here's the finishing step. You need to lock that in somehow. So what you do with that is, again, 2 fingers, make a loop, reach through with your thumb on that loop. See how I got 3 through there now? And then pinch that with your index finger and your thumb, pull it through the loop, lock it tight. There you go. Now you've done an official butcher's knot on your piece of game. Once you get good at it, it'll go a lot faster. There are faster knots to use, but I like this one because it's especially easy to position on pieces of meat that aren't holding together well, or well, it's just versatile, and you can even use it in situations other than cutting meat. So there you go. There's my final tip for stepping up your game cutting a notch. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at what we've done here. Of course, this deer is a long ways from being finished and wrapped up and in the freezer, but just wanted to quickly recap this. Here we've got our 2 racks of venison ready to be wrapped up. And then we've got these little loin cuts here, beautiful loin cuts. That's going to make for some awesome steak, ready to go. And then we've got these things here. We've got the neck and these little shank bits over here. Now all of that would have been ground into ground deer, right? That would have been just burger, and it would have been a crying shame to waste it. So just in the short little bit of time, before we even got into any of the conventional cuts like this, your normal roasts and things that you expect to get from a deer, we've already got all these nice cuts that take better advantage of the deer that we've harvested. So hope that helps you a little bit in your game processing, and yeah, check out some other videos out there for basic processing. There's some really great ones on YouTube. I'd have a hard time competing with them, but yeah, make the most of any animal you harvest. That's all I can say. Thanks for watching.